Jake Williams, a seasoned long-distance truck driver, adjusted his grip on the steering wheel as his rig roared down the desolate stretch of Route 66. The night was unusually oppressive, the moon obscured by thick clouds, leaving only the faint glow of his truck's headlights to pierce the inky darkness. Fog clung to the road like a living thing, swirling and shifting in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Jake had always found comfort in the solitude of the open road, the endless miles stretching ahead of him a balm for his weary soul. But tonight was different. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding, as if the very road beneath him was alive, watching, waiting. He had heard the stories, of course. Every trucker who'd been on the road long enough had. Strange things happened on Route 66, especially at night. Disappearances, ghostly apparitions, and time slips were just a few of the tales whispered at truck stops and diners across the country. But Jake had never put much stock in them. He was a practical man, grounded in the reality of the road and the demands of his job. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, lurking just beyond the reach of his headlights. As midnight approached, the road ahead seemed to stretch into infinity, a never-ending ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the void. Jake rubbed his eyes, trying to banish the wariness creeping into his bones, when he saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the gloom. The man was tall, his face hidden in the shadows of a hood, his clothes tattered and soaked from the relentless rain. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew the dangers of picking up hitchhikers, especially on a night like this. But something compelled him to slow down, to pull over despite the voice in his head screaming at him to keep driving. The hitchhiker slid into the passenger seat without a word, the cab door closing with a heavy thud that echoed in the stillness. Jake stole a glance at the man, but his face remained obscured by the hood, only his eyes visible, cold, dark, and unreadable. An uneasy silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Jake cleared his throat, trying to shake off the tension. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice sounding too loud in the confined space. The hitchhiker turned his head slightly, his gaze never leaving the road ahead. "Nowhere," he replied, his voice low and gravelly, as if unused to speaking. Jake frowned. "What's your name?" "Sam," the man answered, his tone flat, emotionless. The conversation faltered, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing mile. Jake tried to make small talk, asking about the weather, the road conditions, anything to break the oppressive quiet. But Sam's responses were cryptic, almost as if he was speaking in riddles. Jake's unease deepened when the truck's radio suddenly crackled to life, blaring static that made his heart race. He reached out to adjust the dial, but the static only grew louder, filling the cab with a cacophony of white noise, set his teeth on edge. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the static stopped, leaving the cab in an eerie silence. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Temperature in the cab had dropped noticeably, and Jake shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart nearly stopping when he thought he saw movement in the back seat, a shadowy figure, just out of focus. But when he turned to look, the seat was empty. His unease turned to fear as he realized something was very wrong. He could feel it in his bones, a primal instinct warning him that he was in danger. And it wasn't just the hitchhiker, it was the road itself, the darkness that seemed to close in around them, fog that swirled with malicious intent. Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Pieces didn't fit, nothing made sense anymore. And then Sam spoke, his voice low and menacing, cutting through the silence like a knife. "You've been down this road before, Jake. You just don't remember." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his mouth dry. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his efforts to keep it steady. Sam turned to face him, and for the first time Jake saw his face, or rather, a lack of it. The hood fell back, revealing a visage that was not human, but something twisted and grotesque, a mask of shadows and darkness that seemed to shift and change with every breath. "I know your secrets, Jake. I know what you've done." Panic surged through Jake as he struggled to keep the truck on the road, his mind reeling. "You don't know anything about me," he shouted. Even as the words left his mouth, He knew they were a lie, because deep down, he could feel it, the truth lurking in the shadows of his mind, a truth he had buried long ago. Now, it was coming back to haunt him. The miles dragged on, roads stretching endlessly before them, an inescapable tunnel of darkness and fog. Jake's knuckles ached from gripping the steering wheel, his eyes darting nervously between the road and the figure beside him. Sam had gone silent, his presence an oppressive weight that filled the cab with a suffocating dread. "Why are you doing this?" Jake finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to look out the window, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, as if recounting a memory. "I was a truck driver once, just like you, years ago. I was on this very road, heading west, just trying to get through the night." Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight. "What happened?" Sam's lips curled into a bitter smile. "I picked up a hitchhiker, much like you did tonight. He seemed harmless enough at first, but as the night wore on, I realized there was something off about him. He knew things about me, things no one else could possibly know." A chill ran down Jake's spine. The similarities were too close, too exact. What did he know? Sam's gaze shifted to Jake, his eyes dark and hollow. He knew everything. My fears, my regrets, the mistakes I'd made on the road. He showed me things, visions of the people I'd hurt, the lives I'd ruined. He made me see their faces, hear their voices, feel their pain. Jake's hands trembled on the steering wheel. "You're lying," he muttered, though he could hear the doubt in his own voice. Sam chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "I wish I was, but the truth is, that hitchhiker wasn't just a man. He was something else, something ancient, something that feeds on guilt and fear. He showed me my worst sins, dragged them out of the darkness and made me confront them. And in the end, he drove me mad." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. "What happened to you?" Sam's expression grew dark, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't survive the night. The hitchhiker drove me to the brink until I couldn't take it anymore. I lost control of the truck, crashed it into the trees. They found my body the next morning, but my soul is trapped here, on this road, cursed to wander it for eternity." Jake's breath hitched, fear clawing at his chest. "Why are you telling me this?" Sam leaned closer, his voice a chilling whisper in Jake's ear. "Because you're next, Jake. You've got your own demons, your own sins to answer for. And this road, this cursed stretch of Route 66, it knows what you've done, and it's going to make you pay." Jake's vision blurred with terror, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out of this nightmare. But the road ahead seemed endless, the darkness unyielding. He knew deep down that there was no escape. The further they drove, the more Jake began to feel as if reality itself was unraveling. Time stretched and warped, the minutes bleeding into hours, hours into an eternity. The road appeared to loop back on itself, the same landmarks passing by repeatedly, as if they were trapped in some endless night. The fog thickened, swallowing the headlights, until it seemed as though they were driving through a void, a world without end. Sam's presence grew unbearable, constant weight on Jake's psyche. His voice, once merely unsettling, now echoed inside Jake's mind, bypassing his ears and burrowing deep into his thoughts. The words were no longer spoken but felt, resonating within his very soul, each syllable a sharp blade slicing through his sanity. "Do you see them, Jake?" Sam's voice whispered, a cruel taunt that sent shivers down Jake's spine. "Do you see the faces of those you've wronged?" Jake's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white with tension. The road ahead was a blur, his vision swimming with fear and exhaustion. And then he saw them, faces distorted and ghostly, flickering in and out of the fog. They floated past the windows, eyes wide with accusation, mouths open in silent screams. No, this isn't real," Jake muttered, his voice cracking with desperation. The faces continued to appear, each one more haunting than the last. He recognized them, the hitchhikers he had driven past without stopping, the stranded motorists he had ignored, the people he had left behind. Their eyes bore into him, filled with sorrow, anger, and a deep, unrelenting pain. "You could have saved them," Sam's voice intoned, a cold judgment that echoed through Jake's mind. "But you didn't, and now their souls are trapped here, just like yours will be." Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of darkness and fear. He could feel himself losing control, his grip on reality slipping away with each passing second. The truck seemed to move of its own accord, the steering wheel no longer under his command. The road ahead twisted and turned in impossible ways, a labyrinth of despair from which there was no escape. In his mind's eye, Jake saw himself at the wheel of the truck. He was no longer in control. He was a passenger in his own body, helpless as the darkness closed in around him. Faces outside the window pressed closer, their eyes burning with an unholy light, their screams now audible, a cacophony of agony that filled the cab with a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The fog cleared, revealing a stretch of road Jake didn't recognize. It was lined with towering trees that seemed to loom over the truck, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The headlights illuminated a sign ahead, its letters barely visible through the grime and rust. "Welcome to Dead Man's Curve." The word sent a chill down Jake's spine, his heart hammering in his chest. Dead Man's Curve was a place every trucker knew about, a notorious stretch of road where countless accidents had occurred. The stories said that the curve had a mind of its own, a malevolent force that lured drivers to their doom. Jake's hands trembled on the wheel as he tried to slow the truck. The brakes wouldn't respond. The steering wheel twisted in his grip, pulling him toward the curve at an alarming speed. Panic surged through him as the truck hurtled forward, the curve looming closer with every heartbeat. "Stop it!" Jake screamed, his voice filled with terror. But Sam was silent, his expression cold and unyielding, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. And then they hit the curve. The truck careened wildly, tires screeching against the asphalt as it skidded out of control. Jake fought to regain control, his hands slipping on the wheel as the world spun around him. The trees blurred into a dizzying whirl of green and black, the road disappearing beneath the wheels as the truck veered off the pavement. And then there was nothing but darkness. When Jake awoke, he was slumped over the steering wheel, the truck's engine silent, cab shrouded in darkness. His head throbbed with pain, his body aching from the impact. Slowly, he lifted his head, blinking away the haze of confusion. The first thing he noticed was the cold. It was bone-chilling, seeping into his very core, and he realized with a start that the cab was covered in frost. His breath fogged in the air, each exhale a plume of white vapor that hung in the stillness. Panic set in as he tried to move, his limbs sluggish and unresponsive. The seatbelt was tight across his chest, cutting into his flesh, and he struggled to release it. When he finally managed to unbuckle himself, he fell forward, his knees hitting the floor of the cab with a dull thud. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. The crash, it all came rushing back in a wave of terror. But as he looked around, he realized something was wrong, terribly wrong. The truck wasn't in a ditch or on the side of the road. It was in a clearing, surrounded by trees that towered above him like silent sentinels. The road was nowhere to be seen, and the sky overhead was a blank, featureless void, devoid of stars or moonlight. Jake stumbled out of the truck, his legs weak and unsteady. The ground beneath him was cold and hard, covered in a thin layer of frost that crunched under his boots. He turned in a slow circle, his heart pounding in his chest as he took in his surroundings. There was no sound, no movement, nothing but the oppressive silence that pressed down on him like a physical weight. It was as if the world itself had been swallowed by the darkness, leaving him stranded in a place that wasn't quite real. "Where am I?" whispered, his voice trembling with fear. A rustle in the trees made him spin around, his heart leaping into his throat. His eyes darted around the clearing, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing but the trees, frost, and the darkness. And then he saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows. It was Sam, his hood pulled low over his face, posture rigid and unmoving. "Welcome to the end of the road, Jake," Sam said, his voice carrying across the clearing with an eerie calm. Jake's breath hitched, his hands trembling as he backed away. This isn't real. It can't be." Sam took a step forward, his presence looming like a specter in the dark. "Oh, it's real, Jake. As real as the sins you've tried to bury." Jake's back hit the side of the truck, his escape route cut off. He could feel the cold metal against his skin, a stark reminder that there was no way out. "Please, I didn't mean to." Sam's expression remained impassive, his eyes dark and empty. "It doesn't matter what you meant, Jake. The road demands payment, and it's time to settle your debt." We're not the mayor, no. The ground beneath Jake's feet trembled, frost cracking and splintering as something rose from the earth. Faces emerged from the frost, the same faces Jake had seen on the road, the hitchhikers, the stranded motorists, the people he had ignored and left behind. Their eyes glowed with a cold, unnatural light, their mouths twisted in silent screams of anguish. Jake's knees buckled, his strength failing him as he fell to the ground. "No, please, I'm sorry." But there was no mercy in Sam's eyes, no forgiveness in his voice. "Your fate was sealed the moment you took this road. Now you will join the others, trapped here for eternity." The faces closed in on Jake, their cold hands reaching for him, pulling him down into the frost. The darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing he heard was Sam's voice, echoing in his mind like a curse. "Welcome to the road to nowhere." The next morning, a state trooper patrolling Route 66 found Jake's truck abandoned on the side of the road, the cab empty, the engine cold. The fog had lifted, revealing the familiar stretch of highway that had seen countless accidents and strange occurrences over the years. The trooper called for backup, and soon a search was underway, but no trace of Jake Williams was ever found. The truck was towed to a nearby impound lot, where it sat untouched, a silent witness to the night's events. Months passed since Jake Williams' disappearance, and the story of the haunted Route 66 spread like wildfire. Truckers and travelers alike shared tales of the cursed road, each adding their own twist to the legend. Some spoke of eerie whispers heard on their radios, others of ghostly figures seen in their rearview mirrors, but all shared a common thread. Dead Man's Curve was a place to be avoided at all costs. One crisp autumn evening, a young trucker named Tom Langley found himself driving along Route 66. Tom had heard the stories, but he was skeptical, brushing them off as nothing more than campfire tales meant to scare rookies like him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road, he cranked up the volume on his radio, determined to keep his mind on anything but the haunting legends. The familiar hum of his truck was comforting, the steady rhythm of the wheels against the pavement, lulling him into a sense of security. But as the night deepened, a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring the road ahead. Tom squinted through the windshield, his hands tightening on the wheel as he slowed his speed. "That's odd," he muttered, glancing at the GPS. The screen flickered, the signal weakening, and for a moment, the display showed nothing but static. A crackle of static came through the radio, followed by a voice, a low, distorted whisper that sent a chill down Tom's spine. He reached for the dial, turning it off, but the voice persisted, growing louder and more insistent. "Help me!" Tom's heart raced as he stared at the radio in disbelief. The voice was faint, barely audible, but the desperation in it was unmistakable. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just a malfunction, glitch in the system. But then the voice spoke again, clearer this time, and Tom felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Please, help me." Against his better judgment, Tom grabbed the radio mic and pressed the talk button. "Who is this? Where are you?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the voice responded, filled with fear and despair. "Dead Man's Curve? They're here. They're coming for me." Tom's blood ran cold. He knew he was close to Dead Man's Curve, the infamous stretch of road where Jake Williams had vanished. The stories flooded back to him, the warnings from other truckers echoing in his mind. But before he could react, the fog thickened, wrapping around his truck like a shroud. The headlights barely pierced the dense mist, illuminating only a few feet of the road ahead. Tom's hands trembled on the wheel as he struggled to keep his truck steady, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, find another route. Something kept him moving forward, an unseen force pulling him toward the curve. As he rounded the bend, the fog parted just enough to reveal a figure standing in the middle of the road. Tom's heart leaped into his throat as he slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. It was a man, his clothes torn and bloodied, his face pale and gaunt. He looked up at Tom with hollow eyes, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pierce Tom's very soul. "Please, help me," the man whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Tom's breath caught in his chest as he realized who it was. Jake William. The man who had disappeared on this very road, now standing before him, a ghostly figure lost in time. Before Tom could react, the fog thickened once more, and Jake's figure began to fade, his outline blurring into the mist. The radio crackled to life again, Jake's voice coming through in broken, desperate fragments. "It won't let me go. The road. It's alive." Tom's mind raced, torn between the desire to help and the overwhelming terror that gripped him. But as Jake's voice faded into static, placed by a chilling silence, Tom knew he had no choice. He had to continue. The truck's engine roared to life as he pressed the gas. The road beneath him seemed to shift, pavement twisting and turning in unnatural ways. The trees on either side loomed closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, their leaves rustling with unseen whispers. Tom's grip on the wheel tightened as he fought to keep control, but the truck seemed to have a mind of its own, pulling him deeper into the heart of the curve. Panic surged through him as the road twisted again, this time into a sharp turn he couldn't avoid. The truck careened wildly, the tires screeching against the asphalt as it skidded off the road and into the forest. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he fought to regain control. But the trees closed in around him, their branches scraping against the sides of the truck, and he knew he was trapped. The last thing Tom saw before the truck crashed into the trees was Jake's ghostly figure, standing at the edge of the road, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Forgive me," Jake's voice whispered through the radio, just as the world went black. Days later, the wreckage of Tom Langley's truck was discovered deep in the forest, far from Dead Man's Curve. The authorities were baffled, unable to explain how the truck had ended up so far off the road, or why there was no sign of Tom anywhere near the scene. As the investigation dragged on, rumors began to spread among the truckers who frequented Route 66. They spoke in hushed tones of the road that came alive at night, the curve that swallowed drivers whole, and the ghosts of those who had been lost to its dark embrace. But no one dared speak of it openly, for fear of attracting the road's wrath. And so, the legend of Route 66 grew, a shadow that haunted the dreams of those who traveled it. And in the stillness of the night, when the fog rolled in and the wind whispered through the trees, the road waited, hungry for the next soul to wander into its grasp. For the road to nowhere never truly ended. It was always waiting, always watching, ready to claim its due.